Creating a Linux machine is no different from creating a Windows machine, but you use a different tool to connect to the Linux machine. You do not use the same RDP or MSTSC console because Linux does not listen on port number 3389. When you use RDP to connect, or when you use MSTSC, like a Microsoft Terminal Services console, to connect to a Windows machine, you're transacting on port number 3389 TCP. But when you connect to a Linux machine, you are doing an SSH on port number 22 TCP. So SSH is an encrypted connection protocol that will allow you to securely sign in over unsecured connections. SSH is a default protocol for Linux virtual machines hosted in Azure. Although SSH itself provides an encrypted connection, using passwords with SSH connection still leaves the VM vulnerable to brute force attacks. A more secure and preferred method of connecting to a VM using SSH is by using a public-private key pairs, also known as SSH keys. In this video, we'll learn how do you create a Linux machine, which I already said that it's no different from creating a Windows-based machines. And we'll then learn how do you create keys, a public and a private key pair, to connect to those Linux instances. A public key is placed on your Linux VM and a private key remains with you on your local system. You always need to protect your private key and do not share it. Let's get started. We'll learn how to create a Linux machine, then create a public and a private key pair to connect to the Linux machine. I'm currently logged into the Azure portal. In the virtual machine section, I will click on the add button to quickly create a Linux machine. Fill in these values. I'll select the resource group called Lab IT. Call this virtual machine as a Linux web server or something. Okay, and then host it in East US. And then I will select image of Linux kind. It could be Ubuntu, Red Hat, SUSE, or CentOS. We do not need so much of computing power to this VM, so I'll select something lesser. Probably 2 gigs of memory should be fine for our lab. I have 2 options to connect to my instance. One is a password and other is an SSH public key. If you select password, it is again the same as Windows, where you type the username, password, and confirm the password. But in case of SSH public key, you need to create a public and a private key pair. And that is done using tools. There are several tools out there which will let you create public and a private key pair. I usually use, in fact, most of the Linux administrators use a PuTTY Gen, which you can download from the internet. Just type PuTTY Gen on the search browser and you will be able to download that quickly. First step that you have to do is click on generate. Now this will open up this box here, and this box will move from left to right only if you move the mouse continuously on this empty blank space, right? So move it for a couple of times. You can also use keystrokes on the keyboard. Once that is ready, this is your public key. Okay, so what you have to do is copy this, copy the whole thing and paste it here. And then make sure that you type a username. Alright, now this will be validated. Make sure that you save a private key because this is a public key which you are embedding inside your Linux machine. Then you need to save a private key. Let's click on save a private key. You have the option to protect it with a password, yes or no. Usually administrators will save it with a password. I'll save it in a folder and give it a name. The name doesn't matter at all. Okay, now that is saved, you can move on. Inbound ports need to have at least port number 22 allowed because Linux listens on port number 22. Unlike Windows, in Windows we selected RDP 3389. In Linux it is SSH 22. Next, because it's a test environment, I can just go for a standard HDD. And since I've explained these particular fields in the previous videos when creating a Windows machine, I'll not go over them again in order to save time. Click next, advanced. In fact, these values are no different from what we had during the VM creation for Windows. Now click on create and then wait for this to complete. I'll pause the video for a minute to get the VM created successfully. Looks like the VM deployment is complete, so let's go to the virtual machine section here and then click on it to get the public IP address. That's my public IP address. I just copied it. It's in my clipboard. Now we do not need this putty gen anymore, right? We need putty. So I will launch putty and copy and paste that public IP. Now I also need to have an SSH key embedded inside this auth. The Linux machine knows about my public key. I need to show the private key to the virtual machine so that there will be a handshake between public and a private key, and hence the term public private key pair. Now if the ports are open, right, if there is a network communication built between the network that you have and between the virtual machine, then you get a pop-up like this. Now everything is alright. Login with root admin, and then I don't need to type the password because now the handshake between public and private key pair happens. It's all ready now. So this virtual machine is ready to be hosted in your production. We are connected. Now you can show your Linux skills to make it a web server or something. So let's quickly make it a web server. Now, just like the way we installed IIS on the Windows machine, you can install Apache on it by just running this command, say sudo yum install and the httpd daemon. Give it a minute, and within a short time it should install and pick up all the libraries from the internet. Install the http daemon on your machine. Alright, so yes. Okay, let's start the service for the Linux machine, which will be sudo service httpd start. Done. Service is started. Now I'll go to the browser and just copy and paste the public IP here. Let's see what happens. Now it's not gonna work. It's still waiting and waiting, and it will time out because we haven't opened port number 80 on the security groups. So I'll go back here, click on networking, and see, if you look at this, just port number 22 is open, and that's why we could successfully connect to the Linux instance. We haven't opened port number 80. Let's open it. Under inbound rules, I just want port number 80 here, which is responsible for HTTP communications. Yeah, and that's all. Just click on add. Give it a second and it should finish that. Okay, looks like port number 80 is open now. I'll go back to this web page and refresh it. It's still waiting. Let's see. So I just refreshed it a couple of times, and now I'm able to see the default page of the Apache web server. So that's how quickly it is to create a Linux machine and also make it a web server. Now you can start putting your own files, your own custom web page inside the Linux machine to make it a custom web page. In this video, we learned how do you create a Linux machine and then use a public and a private key pair to connect to that Linux machine. So instead of using passwords, you will use a public private key pair. We also made that Linux machine as a web server, opened port number 80 on the network security groups, and then we were able to access the Linux machine using the browser, using http:// public IP.